The store was quiet that afternoon. The air carried the usual scent of fresh produce and coffee brewing in the back. A few customers wandered through the aisles, pushing carts, picking up items, lost in their thoughts. Then, she walked in. A woman, dressed in old, faded clothes, stepped through the doors. Her coat looked oversized, the sleeves too long, and her shoes were worn out. Strands of unkempt hair framed her tired face. She held a small shopping list in one hand, her other hand gripping her purse tightly, as if guarding the little she had left. The store clerk at the register barely looked up at first. But when she approached, he did a double-take. A smirk spread across his face as he nudged his coworker beside him. "Would you look at this?" he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Did someone just walk out of a time machine from 20 years ago? The coworker chuckled. The woman froze for a second, her fingers tightening around the handle of her shopping cart. She let out a small breath but didn't say a word. She simply moved toward the aisle, focusing on her shopping. But the clerk wasn't done. As she picked up a box of cereal, he whispered again, "Hope she has enough to pay. She looks like she walked straight out of a homeless shelter." This time, a few customers overheard. A woman near the dairy section frowned. A man checking out some canned goods turned his head slightly, pretending not to listen but clearly hearing everything. The woman, however, remained silent. She calmly picked up the items she needed and walked toward the checkout counter. The clerk stood behind the register, tapping his fingers impatiently. When she placed her groceries on the counter, he didn't even bother hiding his amusement. Well, he said, scanning the items one by one. "Big day out, huh?" She lifted her gaze and looked directly into his eyes. For the first time, he noticed something different. Her expression wasn't hurt. It wasn't angry. It was calm. Almost unsettlingly calm. Like she knew something he didn't. The line behind her grew. A few people had stopped pretending to ignore what was happening. The woman reached into her purse, pulled out her card, and handed it over. "You should be careful," she said in a soft voice. "The way you treat people has a way of coming back to you." The clerk scoffed, swiping her card without a second thought. "Yeah, sure. I'll remember that." A beep. A flash of green on the screen. Transaction approved. She took her bag of groceries, gave him one last unreadable look, and walked out the door. At first, everything seemed normal. The store clerk laughed it off, shaking his head as if it was just another uneventful day at work. But something was about to change. Something big. And he had no idea what was coming. The automatic doors slid shut behind her, and the store clerk let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Did you see that?" he muttered to his coworker, still amused by his own joke. "Some people just don't belong in." "We have received a formal complaint regarding the mistreatment of a valued customer at one of our locations. This behavior is unacceptable and will be reviewed immediately. The individual in question must be addressed with serious consequences." A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. "Mistreatment of a customer," he scoffed, trying to downplay it. "That's ridiculous. She wasn't some." The manager slammed a hand on the desk. "Do you even know who she is?" he snapped. The clerk faltered. "She's just some." "No," the manager leaned in, voice low. "She's not just some random woman." A pause. A deep, heavy silence. Then, the manager continued. "She is connected to someone very, very powerful. And you just made a massive mistake." The clerk swallowed hard, but his voice still carried a hint of arrogance. "Look, I don't get what the big deal is. It was just a joke." The manager stared at him, eyes filled with disbelief. Then, shaking his head, he muttered. "You don't understand. But you will. Very soon." The tension in the room thickened. The clerk wanted to laugh it off, to pretend none of this mattered. But deep down, for the first time, a small flicker of fear settled in his chest. Something was happening. Something big. And he wasn't ready for it. The store clerk left the manager's office feeling an unfamiliar sensation creeping up his spine, unease. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he should brush it off. As he stepped back onto the floor, his coworkers exchanged glances, whispers passing between them like ripples in still water. He ignored it. But something felt different. A strange presence. The morning rush came and went, but the store didn't feel the same. Customers gave him long, knowing looks, as if they knew something he didn't. An elderly woman who regularly shopped there shook her head at him as she passed. Disappointing, she muttered under her breath. His jaw clenched. What was going on? Then, around noon, he noticed a man in a sharp suit enter the store. He didn't look like the usual customer, no cart, no shopping list, no casual browsing. He moved with purpose. The clerk's stomach twisted as he watched the man walk straight toward the store manager's office without a word. A few employees exchanged nervous glances. "Who's that?" the clerk whispered to the coworker next to him. The guy shrugged. "No idea, but I wouldn't want to be on his bad side." Something wasn't right. Minutes later, the manager emerged from his office, looking paler than usual. His eyes scanned the floor, locking onto the clerk. He motioned him over with a single, stiff nod. The clerk hesitated, but there was no escaping it. He wiped his sweaty palms on his uniform and made his way across the floor, his heart pounding harder with every step. The beginning of the end. Inside the office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The man in the suit sat on the manager's desk, arms crossed, his gaze sharp and unreadable. The manager shut the door behind them. "You need to sit down," he said, voice tight. The clerk reluctantly lowered himself into the chair, trying to act unbothered. The man in the suit leaned forward. "Tell me, do you remember the woman from yesterday?" The clerk's throat went dry. He knew exactly who they were talking about. Still, he forced a casual shrug. "Yeah, so what?" The man didn't blink. "So what?" he repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Then, he placed a sleek, black envelope on the table and slid it toward the clerk. "This," he said, tapping the envelope, "is why you should be worried." The clerk swallowed hard before slowly picking it up. Inside, there was only one thing. A single sheet of paper. He pulled it out, his hands slightly shaking. As his eyes scanned the contents, his blood ran cold. Because the name on the letter was one he recognized, a name he never expected to be connected to that woman. And suddenly, he knew. He had messed with the wrong person. The store clerk's hands trembled as he stared at the letter. The name at the top of the page made his stomach churn. This wasn't just some random woman. This was someone with power, influence, someone untouchable. He gulped, his mouth suddenly dry. This has to be a joke, right?" he muttered, looking up at the man in the suit. The man didn't blink. "I don't joke," he said coolly. The clerk's breathing grew shallow. His mind raced. How was this possible? She looked like she had nothing, like she barely had enough to buy her groceries. And yet. He looked back at the letter, rereading the words over and over. She wasn't just anyone. She was connected to the company's biggest investor. And not just connected. She was his mother. A mistake that couldn't be erased. The silence in the office felt suffocating. The manager stood off to the side, arms crossed, his face grim. The man in the suit leaned back, watching the clerk's reaction carefully. She didn't want this to escalate, the man continued. She wasn't going to say anything. The man in the suit's expression hardened. "A joke?" he repeated. That joke humiliated a woman who has done more for this company than you ever will. That joke insulted the wrong person. The words hit like a punch to the gut. His usual arrogance was gone now, replaced by a creeping realization. He had crossed a line, one he could never undo. And now, the real consequences were coming. The store clerk sat frozen, his mind spiraling as the weight of the situation crushed him. The woman he had mocked wasn't just some random customer. She was the mother of the company's biggest investor. And he had publicly humiliated her. His hands balled into fists, his usual smug confidence shattered. He looked up at the man in the suit, desperation creeping into his voice. There has to be a way to fix this," he stammered. I didn't know who she was." The man in the suit gave him a cold, unimpressed look. "And if she wasn't someone important, would your actions have been justified?" The words hit like a slap to the face. The clerk swallowed hard. He had no answer. The manager, who had been silently watching, finally sighed. "Corporate wants you gone," he said. "Effective immediately." The clerk's stomach dropped. "Fired." Just like that. He opened his mouth to protest, but the man in the suit continued. "You're lucky she isn't pushing for a lawsuit. If she had, you wouldn't just be losing your job, you'd be losing everything." A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was the beginning of the end. The fall begins. The manager slid a termination form across the desk. "Sign it," he said flatly. The store clerk's hands trembled as he picked up the pen. He had always thought he was untouchable. That words didn't matter. That his actions had no real consequences. But now? Now he was about to lose everything. And the worst part? The woman he mocked never even had to say a word. Her presence alone had been enough to change his fate. As he signed the paper, a sickening realization washed over him. This wasn't just about him. This was about how he treated people. And for the first time, he wondered. How many others had he hurt before this moment? The store clerk sat there, staring at the termination form in front of him. The ink on his signature was still drying. It was official, he was fired. For years, he had walked through these aisles with an air of arrogance, cracking jokes at customers' expense, never once considering how his words might affect someone. Now, one mistake had cost him everything. The manager grabbed the form and let out a tired sigh. "Clean out your locker. Security will escort you out." The clerk felt a lump rise in his throat, but he refused to show weakness. He forced a smirk onto his face. "So that's it, huh? One mistake and I'm done." The man in the suit raised an eyebrow. "One mistake," he repeated. "This wasn't just about yesterday." The clerk frowned. "What do you mean?" The manager folded his arms. "Customers have been complaining about you for months. Rude behavior. Smart comments. A general lack of respect." The suit nodded. "You think this is just about her? This was the final straw. You built this outcome yourself." The clerk opened his mouth to argue, but for the first time, he had no words. Because deep down, he knew they were right. A harsh dose of reality. As he walked through the store, employees whispered, customers watched him with quiet judgment. He wasn't just some guy getting fired. He was a man facing the consequences of his own actions. His locker was nearly empty, he had never cared enough to make this place feel like home. He slammed the door shut and turned, only to see the woman standing there. The same woman he had mocked. Calm. Composed. Powerful in a way he didn't understand. His throat went dry. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then, he did something he had never done before. He lowered his gaze and muttered, "I'm sorry." It was weak, almost meaningless at this point. But she simply smiled. Not with malice. Not with pity. Just with a quiet understanding. "Good luck," she said softly. And then she walked away, leaving him alone with his regrets. The store clerk watched her walk away, her quiet dignity hitting him harder than any punishment ever could. She could have destroyed him. She had the power, the connections, she could have made sure he never found another job again. But she didn't. She had simply let his own actions be his downfall. And somehow, that was worse. The aftermath. Security escorted him out, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him for the last time. He stood in the parking lot, jobless, humiliated, and completely lost. His entire identity had been wrapped up in being untouchable, the guy who could say anything, do anything, and never face the consequences. Now he was just another unemployed man with no real direction. The air felt colder than usual. He stuffed his hands into his pockets and started walking. Where? He didn't know. But one thing was clear, his life had just changed forever. A glimmer of redemption. Days passed. Then a week. His savings were running low. Applications were sent out. No responses. He was starting to realize just how small the world could be when doors began closing around him. Then, one afternoon, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A familiar voice greeted him. The woman. His breath hitched. Hello? I heard you've been looking for work, she said, her voice gentle but firm. His heart pounded. I have an offer for you, she interrupted. One condition. He swallowed hard. What is it? There was a pause. Then, she spoke. You learn how to treat people with respect. The words stung. But for the first time, he truly listened. And for the first time, he was ready to change. The store clerk sat in a quiet cafe, staring at the coffee in front of him. He had never expected a second chance. But here he was, sitting across from the very woman he had mocked. She was nothing like he had imagined. No anger. No bitterness. Just calm, quiet wisdom in her eyes. She had offered him a job at one of her charity organizations, not out of pity, but because she believed in redemption. You don't have to take it, she said, sipping her tea. But I believe people can change. A moment of truth. The clerk hesitated, the weight of his past actions crushing down on him. Why? He finally asked, voice raw. Why give me another chance? She studied him for a moment. Then, she smiled. Because someone once gave me one. His chest tightened. For the first time, he understood. Life wasn't just about what you lost. It was about what you learned. The final decision. He took the job. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't high-paying. But it taught him what he had ignored for so long, that kindness was not weakness. It was the strongest thing a person could have. Months passed. The arrogant, careless man he had been? Gone. In his place stood someone who had learned the hardest lesson of all. Your words can build someone up, or destroy them. And if you use them carelessly, one day, you might be the one left broken. As he looked at the woman who had changed his life, he gave a small nod of gratitude. Thank you, he said. And this time, he truly meant it.